around 3 or 4 months ago, I took a look at this. Now this is a Quanta T22HF blade server. You could fit 2 of these into a 1U chassis, and it is overall a very intriguing platform. We've got a single first generation Epyc CPU with 8 channels of DDR4 memory. We've got dual X16 PCI Express 3.0 slots up front, as well as 10 gigabit networking on board. But I ran into a bit of a snag. You see, this system as it sits today only runs first generation Epyc CPUs, and even then the SKU list is pretty limited. I did get this to boot with an Epyc 7351P, which is a 16 core part, but that makes it no better than running an Intel Xeon Broadwell CPU. To make matters worse, Quanta straight up refused to send me any files, documentation, or BIOS updates for this platform. And this platform should support Epyc Rome. So today, we're going to see if we can teach an old dog some new tricks and upgrade these systems to support Epyc Rome CPUs, up to and including maybe a 64-core part. Stay tuned. Today's video is brought to you by me. Check out craftcomputing.store for all of my official merch and help fund the content that you enjoy watching here on the channel. From custom laser-engraved pint glasses to coasters and whiskey stones, and even our brand new double-wall insulated coffee tumblers, all of my merch is designed 100% in-house and made to order by me. I'm also now offering flat-rate international shipping to 23 different countries, and if you live in the continental US, free shipping on orders over $35. So, what are you waiting for? Head on over to craftcomputing.store and start drinking like a pro. Cheers, everyone. Welcome back to Craft Computing, everyone. As always, I'm Jeff. So if it wasn't obvious from the intro, the plan for today should be pretty straightforward. I need to BIOS update these node servers to see if they will support 2nd gen Epyc. Now, I do still have these 7351P CPUs installed in each node, so we should be able to boot up into the Naples CPUs, apply the BIOS updates, take the old CPUs out, put some Rome CPUs in their place, and hopefully they work. Now, like I said, this server has not been in my rack for about the last 4 months, so plan number 1 is to put the rails back in and get this thing back into the server rack. That presents some issues, as back in February, I wasn't running my air conditioning system, and so I had actually removed the air conditioning duct from the rear of the server rack so this long boy could fit. It's the middle of summer now. The air conditioning's kind of important. So the door on my server rack needs to close, but I don't know if the server will actually fit all the way into the chassis as I need it to. So this could get a little bit interesting. But I refuse to start this up on my desk because, well, it's also the middle of summer and this is really loud and I don't need any more heat being generated in my office. So, might be a little bit janky, but let's go ahead and get this thing installed. All right, so I got the server to fit inside the rack, and as you can see, the door is closed. Sometimes your HVAC ducting just needs a little encouragement. So, nothing left to do but get those powered on and apply the BIOS update. So I'm gonna go upstairs and create the USB key with the BIOS update on it. This should be a fairly straightforward process. In fact, I believe there's a BIOS update option either on the BMC or inside of the BIOS itself. So either way, we should be able to flash this pretty easily. And then, hopefully we can rock some Epyc Rome. All right. Server is installed. We've got memory in it. We've got the CPU in it. We've got power. Hopefully, we're ready to update the BIOS. Let's see how this goes. That. Hey, we got a post. All right. Epyc 7351P. We should be able to boot into EFI shell. Should be able to, being the operative word here. UEFI. Why is EFI shell not a boot option? Because IBAXE is usually network. That should be our 10 gig mezzanine. All right, this might prove to be slightly more difficult than I was hoping it would be. Let's see if there's a EFI shell on the boot menu. Because of course this wasn't going to be just dead simple, right? Okay, BBS pop-up menu. Yeah, that's just LAN. Yep. And for some reason, it's still going legacy. That's weird. Oh, that's right, I had this issue before. No, that's right. On this BIOS, I couldn't boot anything off UEFI, even though I selected UEFI as the only boot mode. Lovely. All right, we're gonna have to go into Windows. So if I jump over to the USB drive that I created, you'll see that there is a BIOS for Windows 64. Apparently all we need to do is run this batch file, and it should update with the 3B21 version of the BIOS. Included in the BIOS file is a full breakdown of the BIOS, as well as bug fixes, features, feature removal, and a whole bunch of other things. It is very important to read through this before you do a BIOS update. You don't want to apply a BIOS and end up bricking your system. The most important thing in this README file, you can see version 1B05, update Naples binary from 3A13 to 3A14 for this motherboard, that is the S5HF, to give dual Naples and Rome BIOS features. What that means is it's an AGESA update to support both Naples and Rome CPUs, and it also should eliminate the SKU limitation that I had on this. Remember, I couldn't get this to boot with anything other than the 7351P. I have 4 other Naples Epyc CPUs, and none of them would post in this system. So hopefully, not only does this allow me to boot Rome, but it will also allow me to boot any Naples CPU that I wanted. So say a 7601 32-core. But let's go ahead and run this batch file. Okay, so we've read the flash. The ROM file information does not match the system BIOS. If forcibly update BIOS, it may destroy the system BIOS. We strongly do not suggest to flash the BIOS. Okay, lovely. So the checksum is different. I cannot say that I recommend doing this, but I think we're going to YOLO it. So if I press E, this will update the entire BIOS region. If I press F, this will force, essentially, to update the entire BIOS region. And if I press A, it will not update. I think I'm going to go with E. All right, here's hoping. Now, while this is going, it is worth noting that also in the README file for this BIOS, it did say at one point that Naples support was removed. I did get 2 different BIOS versions in this dump. One of them is the last generation for Naples support, and that BIOS update was sometime around 2020. This BIOS is circa 2022 and only supports Rome CPUs. So if you're doing these BIOS updates, which I will make available, links in the description, be aware of which one you need. If you update to the wrong BIOS, you will need a CPU from that generation to downgrade it to the BIOS that you do need. And this is why we read the BIOS files. But we are past the point of no return. We have erased the BIOS, we have updated the BIOS, and now we are verifying block by block to make sure all the data is actually there. All right, so that is one updated BIOS. Now in theory, if I shut this down, this CPU should no longer post, because this is the 7351P. So let's see what happens. Let's shut it down. So we are powered off. Let's go ahead and power it back on. I am curious if it actually removed Naples support or if it just was like an end of official support. We'll find out here in a second. I don't see why they'd remove a functioning AGESA, but who knows? Quanta's made other very odd and questionable decisions with this server over the years. Okay, the fan spun up, fan spun back down. Now we're just waiting on a post. All right, so this has been chilling here for right around 7 or 8 minutes now. I don't think it is going to post with the 7351P. So let's go ahead and get this swapped over to a 7282, and let's hope and pray that I didn't just brick this board. I know it said it wasn't supported, but everything in the documentation said it was for this specific motherboard. Hopefully there's nothing weird about this particular Quanta board, because this one had... Yeah, this whole project has never gone the way I expected it to. Let's get that CPU swapped out. it's not going well. Got the CPU swapped over to the 7282. It should be a supported CPU on this board now. But as you can see, I don't have a post yet. I've been sitting here for almost 15 minutes now. Sometimes Epyc, especially Epyc Rome, can take a while to post. And I'm getting no activity whatsoever. Now, there is a little bit of a saving grace. The reason I decided to roll the dice and let's just apply the BIOS update. You can update the BIOS from the BMC. So I should still be able to dial into the BMC, reapply a BIOS update, or maybe we'll try the 2020 BIOS update and see if that's able to get a post out of this thing. I'll also go back and check the documentation. I want to see if the 2020 supports both Naples and Rome, because if that's the one that does, that's the one I'm going to use, because I don't like the idea of not being able to switch back and forth between generations of CPUs. So I'm going to go hit the drawing board. We're going to investigate the BMC, maybe push a BIOS update to it, and hopefully I'll be back with some better news. That bottle was getting low anyway. Oh boy, where to even begin with this one? Obviously back in February when I bought this server, I had some pretty high hopes and very high expectations for it. There's obviously a ton of CPU horsepower potential in a dual-node Epyc Rome powered server. Unfortunately, and especially after today, all of that potential is completely wasted because of decisions that Quanta made for any secondary market purposes. I mentioned all the way back in that first video that I had actually reached out to Quanta and I requested any documentation, any BIOS files, any QVLs, anything that they possibly had that they could supply me to make the server work again. And I was told they don't have any QVLs and we don't recommend using CPUs that are not on the QVL, nor do we have any of the files that you requested. So, we can't show you the QVL, but don't run CPUs that aren't in the QVL. Really helpful. After about 8 or 10 full working days spent trying to get this server working for home lab purposes, I eventually gave up on the project simply because the cost to performance and the power to performance wasn't there. I did get the server up and running with an Epyc first generation 7351P. That's a Naples-powered 16-core processor with 32 threads, but it has a turbo of only 2.9 gigahertz. And while it is very comparable to a Xeon E5 2697, which is another 16-core processor based on Broadwell, it didn't beat it. It just barely tied it. And in fact, with single-threaded performance, because the Xeon turbo's higher, the Naples was not a great option. So I took the server out of my rack, placed it on the shelf, either to sell later on to some other, curious home labber, or just never revisit it again. That is until Drew and Oliver reached out to me, and they are looking at putting together a cluster of these servers for a basically student access HPC cluster for their university. Very, very cool project. Obviously, HPC compute is very expensive, and lease times can be wildly expensive depending on your use case. And while their college does have an HPC center that you can lease out time to, it's not really readily available for people who just want to try out some basic projects. So they are building a cluster that they can add to the campus to basically allow students to test out AI projects or virtualization stacks or cluster projects without breaking the bank. So very, very cool and good on you guys. Now, they reached out to Quanta, and maybe it was because they got a hold of the right person, or maybe it's because they were looking to do it in the education space. Quanta actually got back to them and answered all of the questions that I had for them, which is, what is your QVL, and what kind of BIOS do you have for this, and can you send me over documentation? And they happily provided that information, and then Oliver and Drew sent that on over to me. So again, huge shout out to you guys. So that brings us to this week's project of getting the BIOS updated on the S5HF motherboards, which are the individual node blades inside of the T22HF 2-node server. So it can finally support Epyc Rome and maybe a 32-core Rome CPU, maybe a 16-core but with a 3.8 gigahertz turbo, something that would actually outright beat a Broadwell-based Xeon. But as you saw just a couple of minutes ago for you guys, but like 4 days ago for me, I went to apply the BIOS update, and it said, hey, the checksum doesn't quite match. But all the documentation that was provided by Quanta, and all of the documentation that I've dug up over the last 3 or 4 months, said this was an S5HF motherboard. It was a T22HF. They provided all the documentation BIOS updates for these particular boxes. And so I just sent it. And now I'm drinking Scotch. So the BIOS updated what said successfully inside of Windows. I then shut down the server and powered it back on. Now I did expect the system to not power back on the first time, as I was still using the Epyc 7351P CPU in there. And in the documentation for all the BIOS updates that they gave us, there was a mention that at one point they added Rome compatibility, but then a couple versions later they dropped Naples compatibility. And so if I was upgrading to the latest BIOS, only Epyc Rome chips would boot in the server now. But I figured, not a big deal. Let me throw in my 7282 and we'll get this system fired back up. Well, the server does turn on, but it never posts. I don't get any video. I don't get any beeps. I don't get any indication that anything is failing. The fans never spin down, which is another fantastic indication that the server itself is not posting. But the reason I decided to just send the BIOS was because, as I quoted, I can always reflash the BIOS via the IPMI because I have access to the IPMI. Yeah, the IPMI is not letting me log in now. I had successfully gotten access to the IPMI. I changed the login, I got logged in. None of my passwords are working. And if the server doesn't post, I can't use IPMI tool to reset the IPMI. And now I'm drinking Scotch. So that was on July 2nd that I did that BIOS update. I then took July 3rd and I tried digging back into the server and trying to get access to the IPMI, but it was kind of like I was back in my first experience with the server back in February, where I was just looking at the motherboard, looking at all the jumpers. Okay, which one does a BIOS reset, and is there a motherboard BIOS recovery option, and is there any way to gain access to this system again? And the long and short answer is no. I can't get back into the IPMI to flash the BIOS, and I can't boot the system to reset the IPMI, but if I could boot the system, I could reset the BIOS anyway. So why, even though this was an absolute fail, am I bothering posting this video anyway? Well, in this hobby, we often buy used components. I mean, that's why we're in here, is we like used enterprise gear. We like running home labs full of enterprise gear that you might work at a client site, or maybe you've used that hardware before. And sometimes it's just fun. Sometimes it's just fun to say I've got a 64-core processor in a box, or, you know, half a terabyte of memory. Fills me with joy. But when it comes down to it, buying used hardware is inherently risky. You don't know the history of the hardware, you don't know how it's been used, you don't know what environment it was in, you don't know how many years it actually has left. And we normally take those risks. I've bought so many used motherboards and processors and memory and refurbished hard drives and used hard drives, and overall, I've gotten fairly lucky. I've had a lot of things that I've gotten many, many years of use out of. But then there's another side of the enterprise used industry, and that is buying a product for which the original manufacturer refuses to acknowledge it even ever existed. And these products are out there, and they are for sale. And the Quanta T22HF is one such product that, even though they've end-of-lifed the server, they have nuked all existence of any documentation, drivers, BIOS updates, support, manuals, firmware, everything from the internet. Which means, even if you wanted to keep this board alive for longer, Quanta's actively fighting against you doing that. I have no problem with companies ending support for hardware. I have a really hard time with companies denying hardware's existence and removing existing drivers and documentation from the internet entirely. I understand from a company you no longer want to support things, then put a banner at the top of the page and say, this product is end-of-life, there will be no more support. But still let those of us who need to use these. It's not unreasonable that someone out there in a business environment is still running a first-generation Epyc Naples CPU. And to have no access to driver downloads for that particular set of hardware is one of the most asinine and intentionally destructive decisions that a company could ever make. They've taken all of that potential of that server that could be used in someone's home lab for a learning environment. It could be used on a college campus for HPC and learning. It could be used by a small medium business that simply can't afford $50,000 for a new server stack. They've taken all of that potential and all of that secondary market use case and literally turned it into instant e-waste because they wanted the space back on their web server. And it feels like it should be a crime. So that's all I have for you today. There's no happy ending with this one. It's literally just a video of a consumer warning and buyer beware. Now, I know what the #1 comment of this video is going to be. It's going to be, well, just try flashing the BIOS chip. You can get a BIOS flash programmer and clip it on there and try to flash it. I tried that with this server already. I do have a chip programmer, and I have the proper sized clip for it. Anytime I would clip it on, it would droop the voltage massively. So there's likely a pin that's being terminated on there that is not allowing the BIOS to be flashed when it is connected to the server motherboard. So if I want to make this system work again, I'm going to have to desolder the BIOS chip from the board and program it off of the board. While that is entirely possible, what's the end game in that scenario? So I could flash on another BIOS that won't boot up with the chips that I need? So I could use a server that, if I revert it back to Naples, still doesn't achieve the original goal of being faster than Broadwell or more dense than Broadwell? There's just not a lot of upside to this conversation. So unfortunately, that's going to do it for today. But I do have a couple very exciting videos coming up first thing this next week. Axe Effect is in Portland right now. I'm just waiting for the boards to be delivered. But because of the holiday weekend and a very lengthy delay in customs, they're still in Portland. They should be arriving on my front porch on Monday. And oh yes, there's going to be an update video about those. While you're waiting for that video to drop, make sure to drop me a like and subscribe to Craft Computing if you haven't done so already. And if you like the content you see on this channel and want to help support me in what I do, consider going on over to craftcomputing.store, where you can pick up one of my fantastic rocks glasses and whiskey stones for days just like this. But that's going to do it for me in this one. Thank you all so much for watching, and as always, I will see you in the next video. Cheers, everyone.